get out my globe and like a tape measure to see who's furthest away. All right, so I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar this evening, Pathological Demand Avoidance with Dr. Judy Eaton. This is part 3 of a 3-part series that Judy has been so kind to do for Operation Diversity. This one's all about strategies for managing your PDA, your mental health issues, things like that, ways that we can kind of go forward now that we know what it is. So what do we do about it, kind of a thing, is where we're kind of looking at it. Dr. Judy Eaton is one of the leading experts in the world about this. Her website is Help for Psychology. If you are looking for assessment or information about her, I strongly recommend, could not recommend higher for you to go see her. So Judy, I would like to turn it over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon, good evening. We've got people, good morning maybe, so I'm not sure where everybody is now. But hello everyone, and welcome back to part 3 of these webinars. I shall just click on, can we move it? Yeah, there we go. The aim is, I've got 2 parts for tonight really. To start off a little bit about thinking about some of the more challenging behaviour in young people with PDA, and then to move on to kind of more serious things like some of the mental health issues that might affect some people who are, you know, who have PDA or are on the autism spectrum. Okay, so to begin with, the idea is to discuss how parents and family members can provide support in manage challenging and distressing behaviour. And I guess what I'd like to say from the start is there are no magic solutions. I'd love to be able to sit here tonight and say this is how you do it. All I'm hoping to provide is a better understanding of some of the causes of challenging behaviour in children and young people with PDA. Okay. Part 2, the kind of more mental health issues part, is really to provide a better understanding of how mental health issues can affect individuals, both children and adults with PDA. And again, the aim of this webinar is not to scare people or raise unnecessary anxiety. The aim is simply to make people aware of the possible difficulties which may occur. And obviously, the earlier that these issues can be identified, the better chance there is of managing them. So it's about kind of recognising what could be the build-up to some of these difficulties. And it's interesting that I'm actually speaking at the PDA conference in April, I think it is, about adults with PDA. And I've just started to sort of try and research the kind of issues that adults with PDA are experiencing. And a very, very quick look at some of the survey results shows that a good 50–60% of adults who identify as having PDA are suffering some kind of mental health issues. So obviously, you know, things have not gone too well in that area. And maybe if we can think about some of the things that might impact on children, we can perhaps hope for a better outcome as these young people grow up. Okay. So basically I was saying having a better understanding of the difficulties and making reasonable adjustments early on, and that's both at home and at school, will hopefully lead to a more positive outcome for the young people and their families. Okay, so first of all, starting with thinking about meltdowns. Meltdowns, it's not a pleasant word, but it's kind of a word that's become associated with the kind of difficulties that a lot of people with PDA will experience. And this is not a temper tantrum. It's not, you know, children being deliberately naughty. This is when the anxiety becomes so high that they actually lose control and are unable to be reached quite often. So thinking about, I mean, you know, what might be the triggers? And I thank very much that the adult blogger, who I won't name here because they may not wish to be mentioned, but explaining what it feels like to have a meltdown. So this is borrowed with great thanks from an adult with PDA who's actually saying what it's like to have PDA. So basically, if doing the demand without any complaints was so easy, wouldn't most people do that? No one wants an argument over having to do a simple task such as getting dressed or taking the bin out. And the energy expended avoiding these can be exhausting for everyone involved. So why do PDA people go to such great lengths to avoid demands? There must be something that is so bad that it's worth a 2-hour fight to avoid it. And the answer is anxiety. And I think this is a brilliant sort of quote here, and really kind of sums it up. They say anxiety can be crippling. Well, for some people it is. It's like a knife tearing into you. A horrible feeling so bad that you do anything to reduce or avoid it. Our brains don't work the way they're supposed to. Anxiety is supposed to keep us alive, help us avoid deadly scenarios. See that poisonous berry over there? It's bad, don't eat it. See that ledge? You're now feeling intense anxiety about it, so you don't go too near and fall to your death. Okay. For people with PDA, it's not a case of what's easier time-wise, it's a case of what's easier anxiety-wise. It might not make sense to us logically, but emotionally it's overwhelming. And I think, you know, for me, that's the take-home message. It's about that anxiety that goes beyond what most people would understand as feeling anxious. And as I say, I think I've talked about this before, but evidence is starting to emerge that children and adults with PDA may have an exaggerated or easily triggered fight, flight or freeze reaction. So what might seem like nothing to a neurotypical person, to someone with PDA is genuinely and scarily overwhelming. Okay. Again, this is the same person describing it. Meltdowns can be in the form of shouting, screaming, throwing things, lashing out, excessive crying, hyperventilating, being sick, etc. People with PDA usually have a meltdown when they're forced into a situation they've tried to avoid due to high levels of anxiety, but have been unsuccessful in avoiding. And so the situation and their emotions and anxiety have escalated to the point whereby they have a meltdown. Many people with PDA become completely unaware of what they're doing at this point. They can even forget what led up to the meltdown once they've calmed down, often returning to what they were doing before their anxiety reached a critical point. And again, that is really interesting to think about in terms of how quickly sometimes young people with PDA can snap out of what seems to be the worst meltdown ever. And, you know, when everybody else's anxiety levels are still up here, they've come back down to what they were doing before. So again, it's that kind of mismatch in some ways. Okay. Meltdowns aren't pleasant for anyone, least of all the person experiencing it. At that point, the PDA person is completely unreachable, and there's little to be done except wait out the attack and try and keep everyone involved safe. It's always best to head off a meltdown before it reaches that point. Sometimes it's difficult to tell when a meltdown is on its way, as many PDA people hide their feelings, known as masking. This means the people close to them have to look closer for the small signs of stress that are likely to trigger a meltdown. Again, from the horse's mouth, this is written by a person with PDA. So, many PDA people, especially young children, are able to mask their anxiety and behaviours in one setting. This can be problematic for all involved, as the person stores all their anxiety and stress in that setting, releasing it when they're in a different setting where they feel comfortable enough to let all their feelings out. This setting is often home and family usually bear the brunt of bottled up stress exploding out all at once. And I think lots of people have heard of the analogy of like shaking a bottle of fizzy drink. If you shake it enough, eventually it will explode. The longer the person has had to mask for, the larger the inevitable explosion. And again, it's that learning to understand that what apparently is the cause of the meltdown might actually be nothing to do with it. It's a bit like the old saying, the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's that point at which it becomes too much. And I think that even neurotypical people can identify with this to a certain extent. The fact that you hide your frustrations at work, you hide your frustrations in certain places, and then you come home and take it out on your loved ones or the dog or whoever happens to get in your way when you walk into the front door. So it's not a uniquely PDA behaviour, but I think what is different is the thresholds and the things that cause that degree of frustration in the first place. Okay, so how do you manage a meltdown? I mean, you know, so often you hear people say, oh, you know, punishment is or there have to be consequences to actions, or give them a good shaking, that'll bring them out of it. I think the main thing to sort of take from this is that when you're managing a PDA meltdown, rewards and sanctions are often, I would say probably always, ineffective. That the whole impairment, if you like, in autism and PDA is often that what we call social imagination, and I've talked about that before. The ability to think forward in time and think what might happen, and also to reflect on what has happened in the past and generalize to a different situation. So that kind of approach is not going to be particularly helpful for someone who has difficulties in actually thinking forward in time or thinking back to the last time it happens, because it's just not going to work. They're not going to be able to make those links, and quite often that kind of approach is likely to make the meltdown worse and make them even angrier. Okay, the child with PDA often knows what they should do, but they just can't. And again, in terms of educating people about PDA, there's often this assumption that these children are badly behaved or badly brought up. Actually, in my experience, they're some of the most well brought up kids. They know what they're supposed to do. They know about good manners. They know about good behaviour. Generally speaking, they have good parenting, but it's just this anxiety stops them from doing what they know they should do. So it's different from a child who's had no boundaries and has never been sort of had the opportunity to experience how to behave appropriately. Traditional parenting techniques often involve clear boundaries, being quite directive and using techniques such as timeout. And these are the kind of parenting techniques that are often put forward at parenting courses that parents of children with PDA are often asked to go to. And again, parents report their frustration when they are sitting through these parenting courses thinking, well, I do that, I've tried that one, you know. And so the traditional kind of behaviour management techniques are unlikely to work. Okay, and so they don't work and often make things worse. Okay, right. Again, this will resonate with a lot of parents that what works one day will not necessarily work the next. It depends on the child's mood and level of anxiety on that day. Many parents I've worked with have said that they know almost as soon as they go into their child's bedroom first thing in the morning what kind of a day it's going to be. You know, some days are good and strategies will work. Some days you could go into the child's bedroom and they're just not having anything on it. It's just not going to be a good day. Their anxiety levels are high, and the strategies that you might have tried one day will not work on this particular day. They might work again tomorrow. Sensory issues also become overwhelming for some children with PDA. And I think I've probably said this before as well, not all behavioural meltdowns are going to be due to anxiety, because it's always learning to distinguish between the aughty and the naughty. It's, you know, there will be times when they want to do what they want, when they want their own way, when they want to have something or go somewhere or push the kind of boundaries, like any children. The difference is because they're inflexible thinking style and because of this difficulty with social imagination, appreciating someone else's point of view is just going to be doubly hard for them. Okay, so a lot of it is about adapting expectations. It's about picking your battles. The obvious one is to reduce demands. And you can't reduce all demands. Life isn't like that. It's not possible to allow or to live in a world where there are no demands. But what we always say is, you know, try and focus on the non-negotiable, the things that simply are the most important things. Disguise demands, I'm sure a lot of you have heard this kind of thing before. Make it a game or use humour. A lot of the time, if you can manage to get in there with a joke before it gets to that point. And again, you know, we have a lot of children at the clinic and you can see they're starting to bubble. And if you're lucky, you can just get in there with something funny, make them laugh, distract them from it, and you can divert it and move them on to something else. It doesn't always work, but it can do. Use distraction, as I said, try and divert their attention onto something else. It's amazing how, and we use it sometimes, you know, the iPad's a good one. if all else fails, you know, try Minecraft. It's not always the answer, but it's about, again, picking your battles. Offer choices. I love this one because it's great, you know, are you going to put your shoes or your trainers on today? The implication is you will wear something on your feet, but it allows that element of choice there. So again, it's allowing as much choices and control as is actually practical. And again, that will vary from day to day and from situation to situation. And one of the things as well, it's about adjusting your expectations in terms of what you expect from the child. I mean, and this is one that comes up over and over again when I talk to parents, is about that instinct that as a neurotypical parent you have when you pick your child up from school. It's like, oh, what kind of day have you had? Have you had a good day? What have you been doing today? Who have you been talking to? What have you played? And for a lot of children, that can be the trigger for a meltdown as soon as they get in the car. And it's kind of a natural instinct to want to know, particularly if you've been anxious about the child all day, you want to know if they've had a good day or if they've had a nice time or if they've played with anyone. But often those first few minutes, sometimes all they need is to be left quietly just to kind of regulate themselves and kind of process the day and prepare for the next part of their day. And another time, you know, again, I was talking to a mum yesterday about this. You might be cross because the child's just dropped their coat and bag on the floor and gone straight to their room, turned the TV on, picked up their tablet or their phone. And, you know, the instinct is to say, come and pick your coat, you know, all those kind of normal things. But sometimes if you know that that's going to trigger a meltdown, is it really worth a battle about it? It's about picking your battles. It's about accepting that your child will have worked really, really hard all day to hold it together, to comply with the requests of the teacher. And actually they do need that time to kind of recharge that social battery when they get in. So sometimes if you plan for that, if you know that that's what's going to happen, then accept it, build it into your day, and don't sweat the small stuff. You know, if the bag's on the floor, if they go straight through and they don't talk to anybody, again, pick your battles really, because it might be better let it go. They need time to calm and process the day. Talking to them or insisting they help tidy up or don't go straight on their devices might not be helpful, and it might be the thing that actually is the trigger that makes them go into meltdown. Okay. Ignore some of the undesirable behaviour. This is really hard. I mean, a lot of behaviour management programs do talk about not focusing on the negatives and trying to focus on the positives. And that is a really helpful thing because, and again, you know, we've had children come through the clinic and, you know, things are difficult. It does get to the point where parents are very stressed and upset and the children are stressed and upset. And we ask them sometimes, can you think of a couple of nice things about your mum and dad? Can you think of a couple of really positive things about your child? It's just to kind of turn it round a bit, because constantly hearing that you're naughty or you're difficult or getting shouted at all the time doesn't really help self-esteem. It doesn't help to build a good, strong self-image for the child. But this is difficult, particularly when you've got other children to think about, because it often seems to the other children that the child with PDA is getting preferential treatment, that they're getting treats or not being told off for the things that they would be told off for. But again, it's about sort of choosing your battles and actually ensuring that the child doesn't grow up thinking that they are some kind of awful, terribly badly behaved child who's always in trouble for something. So it's about getting a balance really. Trying to stay calm and neutral. Again, this is a really tough one because children with PDA can and do push parents to the absolute limit. And the problem is because they are so anxious and they're in this fight, flight or freeze, they're going to be hyper aware of your mood. And if you appear to be out of control or losing it yourself, what they will feel as children is a lack of containment, because as a parent, children expect you to contain them and hold them emotionally when they're upset. And if they're picking up, because a lot of kids with PDA are hyper aware of what's going on, they will feel more out of control and more panicked. So even if you feel like you're the worst parent in the world and you've shouted and you don't think you can cope with it anymore, try and be a little bit like the swan. The swan glides very calmly along on the surface. The little legs are paddling like mad beneath the surface, but it's about giving that impression that you can calm, you've got this, you can handle it. Okay, go out of the room afterwards and have a good cry or a glass of wine or something, but in that moment, if you can give the impression that you've got this, that you're okay with it. And again, if you do lose your temper, don't beat yourself up over it. Parents are human. They have their own challenges themselves. So, take 5 minutes, take a deep breath and move on to the next challenge. Try not to feel too judged by other people. That's another, a lot of time people report feeling terribly judged by people out in public if their child's having a meltdown, or people will make really unhelpful comments. The best thing you can do is try and grow a thick skin, because they're not in your shoes. You're doing the best you can. And, some of these kids can be some of the most challenging children to work with. So if, just by getting through the day, you're doing a great job. Okay. Every day is different. Every day will be a different challenge, and you just have to take one day at a time, I guess. Okay. Managing more serious meltdowns, and this is something that, again, for those people out there who are not experiencing that kind of really troubling meltdowns, this isn't meant to frighten people, and not every child will experience this, but some children will have more serious meltdowns. Some can become extremely aggressive, and some can even become violent. Some can attempt to attack parents and family members with knives and scissors and anything else they can get their hands on. And this is perhaps the most distressing situation, because as a parent, your duty is towards your child with PDA, but you also have a duty towards other children who might be in the firing line. And it is perhaps the most difficult situation to deal with. Some trash their rooms, destroy property, and a lot of parents worry about what might happen when the child is bigger and stronger than they are. It's one thing to be able to pick a 2-3-year-old up and pop them in the car seat. It's another thing dealing with an extremely angry and upset 15-16-year-old. And it is, it can be a very difficult situation. The main priority is to keep yourself and siblings safe. And if that means removing yourself to a room away from where everything's going on, then so be it. So remove them, allow the child to calm. Sometimes just leave it. Yes, they may carry on trashing the room, but the main priority is to keep yourself and other siblings safe. Calling the police. This is a difficult one, because it's a last resort, but some parents do feel obliged to do this, even if it's not what they really want to do, because they feel that they can't handle the situation. And actually what parents have said is that sometimes just being spoken to by a policeman is enough to diffuse the situation. But obviously the last thing a parent wants is for their child to have a police record or to have to spend time in a police cell. But the priority is, though, to keep everyone safe. And there are safeguarding issues with regard to siblings, and I know that it can be really difficult to get support, because I've supported several families trying to get support for a very challenging young person, and it is difficult. But as I said, there are no easy answers, but hopefully, you know, if you can keep yourself safe and keep out of the way, and so, as I say, sometimes someone else coming in and saying something can be enough to diffuse the situation. And a lot of police are actually very helpful and quite supportive in these situations. I mean, again, I can't generalise, but the parents that I've spoken to that have had to go down this route have actually been quite positive about the people who've come to help them. So it's there as a possibility. Okay, I couldn't remember when I was putting this together whether I'd actually mentioned about PBS, positive behaviour support, but it's worth mentioning again in the context of this kind of webinar. Positive behaviour support is a framework for supporting people who present with challenging behaviour, and it was initially developed for use with individuals with learning disability, but it's becoming incredibly popular in other settings where children and young people particularly are presenting with extreme challenging behaviour. And the overall goal is to improve quality of life for the individuals and those who care for them through a kind of fairly structured programme of behavioural support. And it works by developing the skills of those who support people with challenging behaviour rather than using any traditional reward or punishment models. So it's quite helpful. And the theory behind it is that all challenging behaviour happens for a reason. All challenging behaviour is actually a form of communication. It's not a good one, it's not a particularly helpful one, but they are trying to tell you something. And PBS works at helping parents and carers to understand the function of the behaviour. What's this all about? What is that young person trying to say? What are they trying to tell you? What is it that's so difficult for them? Because understanding why it's happening is the first step to managing challenging behaviour. It's not, again, it's not intended to be a quick fix, and it's not easy, or as I say, it's not a quick thing to do. Okay, so the challenging behaviour finder, and I apologise to people who are outside of the UK listening to this, but this is the UK website, but I'm sure if people outside the UK contacted this particular group of people, they would be able to, you know, point people in the right direction to access these resources in other parts of the world. But they actually have a free DVD available for families and carers, and it's called Challenging Behaviour Supporting Change, and it gives you access to it gives you the links to the resources and how you can access this kind of support for your family. So it's worth having a look at, and it's worth kind of exploring. Okay. Oh, so it also offers a free information pack. There you go, pbsacademy.org.uk. So again, those are things which I'm sure if you have access to the slides for a while, can you give me a thumbs up, Glenn? Are they going to have access to the slides for a bit to get the email for the challenging behaviour thing? Hopefully. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Moving on then to looking a little more about kind of some of the mental health difficulties which may occur with individuals with autism. And obviously anxiety is your top one. And again, my very brief, quick and dirty survey of adults with PDA, and there were some issues about the fact that people would have liked to have ticked several different things that affected them, but I actually asked people in the questionnaire to say the main one. I think that the kind of message from that was that people are actually dealing with more challenges than just anxiety, but anxiety was the big one again, that even in adulthood was still an issue for people with PDA. Obviously anxiety can lead to depression, to you know, a continual low mood that continues over a period of time. Obsessive compulsive disorder, obsessive compulsive behaviours is also something that can be, again, it all comes back to the need for control and the need to manage your environment. And again, these kind of behaviours can become more apparent if you're suffering from high levels of anxiety. Tourette syndrome is a known link, and it's not necessarily a mental health difficulty in itself, and I wouldn't like to say it was, but sometimes having to deal with Tourette's, which again often gets a lot worse when you become anxious, can lead to a lot of anxiety, and it can lead to depression. I've worked with young people who have become extremely down about the impact that Tourette's is having upon their ability to carry out their everyday life. Dissociative disorders, again, I'll be talking a bit more about those, but more about when people actually become so overwhelmed with anxiety that they actually shut down. Brief psychotic episodes, and eating disorders. And these are the ones that I've kind of picked out as being the kind of the main ones that cause extreme distress for people who are actually experiencing them. So why might mental health issues develop for children with PDA? For younger children, poor social skills, leading to misunderstandings, poor ability to make and negotiate friendships. Their superficial sociability often breaks down when friendship becomes more complex. So again, there's the need for control. There's the way that friendships become increasingly more complex as you go through infant and junior school. And a lack of social imagination and flexible thinking, leading to difficulties in sharing or playing someone else's game. So, you know, these are the kind of things that start to cause anxiety for younger children with PDA. For older children and teenagers, it's a little bit more complex. They may experience rejection and bullying by their peers. They may be very vulnerable to peer pressure. You know, there is particularly those young people with PDA who are very good at imitating and copying and sort of mimicking what their peers are doing. Sometimes they can get sucked into things that perhaps are not good choices. Poor or poorer than expected academic achievements. A lot of people with PDA will have quite perfectionist tendencies. They will want to do as well or the best they possibly can. And again, I can't remember if I've talked about this, but obviously adolescence is a time when there's huge brain development, and people with PDA seem to be a little bit slower to catch up with this. So quite often a child or a young person who's been doing really quite well at primary school, they move to high school and it becomes unexpectedly harder for them. So that can cause anxiety and stress for them because they're not doing as well as they hoped they would or that they had been doing in the past. A poor sense of self and identity. A lot of these young people will be struggling, like a lot of teenagers, to find out who they want to be and to sort of develop the kind of person they want to be. And that's difficult enough for teenagers anyway. Seems to be even harder for youngsters with PDA to work out who they are and to have the confidence to be who they want to be, because there's such a lot of pressure to fit in with what is seen as the norm. And for adults with PDA, you know, many and not all, again, this is a generalization, might have poor sociosexual knowledge, by which I mean how to negotiate relationships and intimate relationships. You know, again, this if you have poor social imagination and you have a decreased ability to actually, you know, express yourself, that can cause problems in relationships, and relationships can break down. Difficulties with social communication, poor social imagination and flexible thinking. It doesn't change when you become an adult. Reduced opportunities potentially to develop intimate relationships, particularly if you have tended to self-isolate as a teenager. Again, the vulnerability to peer pressure. For some, the use of alcohol or recreational drugs as a social facilitator. I've spoken to many young adults who have veered towards drinking or recreational drugs because in that brief moment it reduces some of the anxiety and makes them feel more socially confident. Unfortunately, what it also means is that they may make poor choices and may actually not be coming across quite as well as they think they are. So it can lead to all sorts of problems. Young people as well may try to use prescription drugs as a way of damping down some of that anxiety, and that there's a lot of potential for addiction to prescribed drugs such as Valium, and I'm not sure what they call them in the States, but benzodiazepines and things like that, because they do have a very good effect of managing anxiety. However, they are very addictive, and it's the body soon builds up a resistance, so that the young person tends to need more. So again, that can lead to further difficulties. Difficulties holding down a job. Again, my brief, quick and dirty survey showed that the majority, at least 50% of the people who returned the survey were not in full-time employment or education. So, you know, very often the potential will be there, but the person is not able to achieve that potential because of the anxiety. So again, all of these things can be factors. So anxiety and depression. Published studies cite 70% of individuals with autism will be suffering from anxiety, and this is probably an underestimate for those with PDA. Teenagers with autism are at particularly high risk of developing features of depression. And disorders such as Tourette's and OCD are also common in autism, which can add to feelings of alienation and difference. Friendship and school difficulties are additional risk factors. And these difficulties can present as lower level issues, such as negative thinking, low self-esteem, social isolation and withdrawal. And the social isolation and withdrawal one is probably the biggest worry with young people with PDA, because if they are feeling bad about themselves or are struggling to cope with anxiety, very often the bedroom and the laptop and the tablet can be a very safe haven, and the longer it seems that they're away from social contact, the harder it can be to actually get back into that world again. So, you know, that can be a cycle in itself. School refusal or school exclusion can add to the problems caused by social isolation. However, these can develop into more serious problems or even mental health issues if the young person begins self-harming or develops suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation. In young people with PDA, anxiety will have been such a core feature of their presentation for most of their lives. It's easy to see how this can progress once they reach their teenage years, with all the added academic and social pressure that this actually involves. Okay, psychotic episodes. For some individuals, the anxiety levels become so intense they may experience brief psychotic episodes when they may report hearing voices or seeing things which are not there. And this is incredibly scary for the young person themselves and for those supporting them. This is not the same as schizophrenia necessarily. There are links, but a brief psychotic episode is very often the young person's inner voice. We all have an inner voice, and it's very often that kind of negative self saying nasty things about themselves. It's not quite as common, in my experience, I know I could be wrong, to have the psychotic episodes where the young person believes that they're being controlled by somebody in the TV or something like that. It's a different kind of episode, and it's very often an exaggerated response to anxiety, in as much it's almost like that inner voice, that little part inside of them becomes too loud. But again, it can be extremely distressing, and it can be distracting, and it can make it hard for the young person to cope. Some young people may become so overwhelmed that they dissociate. It's the fight, flight or freeze response. And at these times they can appear completely shut off from people around them. They can be difficult to reach, and they can be difficult to communicate with. And dissociative disorders can fall into 3 different categories. And I'm mentioning this because there is, again, it's only anecdotal and it's only my own clinical experience, but there are a number of young people with PDA who have reported, or whose parents have reported, this kind of almost like two personalities, this whole Jekyll and Hyde kind of presentation, and I'll try to sort of explain it. There's dissociative amnesia, which is where you can't recall things when you're in this state. And again, that's not what I wanted to talk about particularly. What I was thinking about mostly was with dissociative identity disorders, which used to be called multiple personality disorders, and depersonalization disorders, when you actually feel that you're not yourself anymore. And these tend to be associated with a traumatic, either single or multiple events. You can have complex trauma. So these things can be triggered by a single trauma or repeated occurrences of the same kind of difficult situation over and over again. And it's almost like the conscious mind splits in order to protect the individual from these painful emotions. So again, that's part of it. And then dissociative identity disorder, this is the one that I wanted to talk about a little bit more. It's a very controversial diagnosis amongst professionals. And in this, individuals seem to develop a number of different personalities, or sometimes called alters, their alter egos, their alternative people. And there's limited research regarding the prevalence of this amongst young people with ASD or PDA. However, in the course of my clinical work, a significant number of individuals with PDA have reported feeling that they've got two different and quite distinct personalities, that there are two sides to them, and this might involve wearing different clothes, reacting in different ways, feeling like a different person. And whether this is a thing, or whether this is just, again, that internal conflict with not quite knowing who to be and how to be, or even possibly an extension of the kind of role play type behaviour that you often see in younger children with PDA when they become a character or they take on the persona of a character. It's very kind of early, and it's just speculation, but I've been surprised at how many both adults and sort of adolescents have reported feeling like they're two different people. So it's something that's certainly worth further exploration, I think. Okay, a little bit about self-harm. There's an awful lot of literature about the issue of self-harm amongst children with autism, but this tends to focus on the children who have more significant learning and communication difficulties. An awful lot of children with learning difficulties will bite their hands or will headbang and that kind of behaviour, and most of the research is focused on that. And self-harm in this group of young people is often used as a form of communication or to express frustration. And about 35% of children with autism reported to engage in behaviours such as hitting or biting themselves or headbanging. And there's some evidence that suggests that there may be a sensory element to some self-harming behaviour in children with autism. It seems to be a mixture of both. It seems to be partly the frustration and being overwhelmed by difficult feelings, and in that moment not being able to express how you feel. But there may be a certain sensory part to it as well. There may be issues around differences in the way pain is processed and experienced by those on the spectrum. Again, the research is limited, but there is some there if people are keen to read about it. And there may be other factors involved in self-harming behaviour, of adolescents particularly. Social media appears to have added to the apparent growth of self-harm amongst adolescents, with many sites actually sharing pictures of self-harming behaviour. This whole website's out there, how to do it and how to do it properly. So, I mean, it's a lot more accessible than it was years ago. I've no doubt that it still existed and went on years ago, and people found it, use it as a coping mechanism. But I think there's almost been an explosion of it at the moment. It's become very much more in the public eye and obvious. And self-harm is often negative and wrongly viewed as being attention-seeking behaviour. It generally isn't. It's about managing emotional pain rather than necessarily wanting the young person wanting people to know what's going on. So how can it be managed? It often appears that it's a way of expressing their emotional distress. And in terms of helping the young person to manage this, some of the techniques suggested in DBT, dialectical behavioural therapy, can be useful. And this includes techniques to improve social skills, manage distress, resolve conflict. It's about interpersonal effectiveness. It was originally designed for people with borderline personality disorder, but the skills part of it, the DBT skills training, can actually be very helpful for young people who are struggling to manage emotions effectively. And with self-harming, it's important to keep lines of communication open and talk about what's happening. And trying to help the young person improve their ability to recognise and express their own feelings is vital. Alternatives to self-harm, such as using an elastic band on the wrist or ice cubes and things, they can help, but again, it's more about actually helping the young person to recognise and express their feelings more appropriately. Maintaining a calm approach, again, think of the swan when you're supporting someone, because again, if the young person sees you being panicked and you being upset, it's going to make them feel less contained and more panicky about what's happened. So again, it's about remaining calm and just dealing with the immediate behaviour. And as I say, before I come on to eating, sometimes just keeping a close eye on sharp things, sharp blades, and having a supply of plasters, antiseptic wipes, and being quite matter of fact and supportive about it can sometimes not stop it, but make it less of an issue and something that the young person is more likely to admit and be able to talk about. And keeping that dialogue open and helping them to understand how they feel is probably the key to this. Okay, coming on to eating disorders, I'm just checking the timer, okay? About eating disorders and autism and PDA. Again, this is another big area because an awful lot of children with autism have what's called ARFID, the avoidant and restrictive food intake disorder, which means that they have an exaggerated disgust response to lots of tastes and textures. So they're already starting off with a vulnerability about what goes into their mouths. And they will often only eat certain types or colours of food, often beige food, and there'll be certain, restrictions about what they can manage to tolerate. Some have an exaggerated disgust response to certain textures. And also, many do not appear to experience hunger in quite the same way as their neurotypical peers. Some children with PDA particularly seem to need reminding to drink and eat. It's coming back to that interoception, that awareness of your body's needs. And so, sometimes they may not experience hunger. Some of them may experience anxiety and mistake this for hunger. So the whole thing gets mixed up in their heads. Teenage girls with autism seem to be particularly at risk of developing eating disorders. Not all of them. It will tend to be those who have had issues about eating throughout their childhood. And again, it's a different kind of thing. And some adult women with PDA reported controlling their eating. In other words, internalizing their feelings rather than having meltdowns as they reach their teenage years. Again, this is anecdotal. This is talking to adult women with PDA. And it's interesting to think about that as another form of having control, if that is something that helps to manage your anxiety. So it's worth thinking about that. Okay, whizzing through that quickly. And again, there is literature out there about more about eating disorders. There is research going on into the number of young women with eating disorders on the autism spectrum. There's a guy called William Mandy, who I can't remember where he's in, somewhere in London, might be UCL, can't remember, but he's actually doing quite a lot of research into eating disorders and females on the autism spectrum. So again, look for William Mandy and Kate Chanturia, I think it is, which is TCHANTURIA. They've done quite a lot of work into eating disorders and girls on the spectrum. Briefly touching on personality disorders. Now, a personality disorder is not a mental health issue as such. It's a description of observed behaviours. And a diagnosis of personality disorder should only be given to individuals over the age of 18, given the fact that personality is something that develops. And, you know, as a teenager, it's quite damaging, I think, to label someone as being disordered in some way, because they're still going through a process of working out who they are. However, an awful lot of young people are given the diagnosis of emerging borderline or emotionally unstable personality disorder, and that is in the DSM as a mental disorder. But actually what it is a description of behaviours. But this type of behaviour often develops in response to life events. It is possible to be given a diagnosis of autism, PDA, and an emerging borderline personality disorder, because it's a description of behaviour. And again, it's about the individual's reaction to events in their life. In someone who's experienced trauma and a difficult childhood, they may develop those behaviours in response to early trauma. In a young person with autism or PDA, they may develop those kind of behaviours and coping strategies in response to the stress and anxiety that they have experienced. So the behaviour might look the same, but again, it's going back to that, what is the function of that behaviour? Okay. And young people with autism and PDA are often given the diagnosis of oppositional defiance disorder, conduct disorder, or even antisocial personality disorder. And this, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time on social media, but I've seen something this week about sort of lumping oppositional defiance disorder and PDA together, which is, for me, a bit of a worrying trend, because they are different, that there are differences in the way they have, the way and the reason they've developed, and also the strategies that work for young people with oppositional behaviour are not the strategies that work for children with PDA. So it's a bit of a worrying trend. That conduct disorder is another worrying one, because a conduct disorder, if you look at the criteria for that, it includes kind of deliberate cruelty towards animals, people, and the majority of young people with PDA, if they do hurt someone, it's not a deliberate and calculated and planned act. It's something that has happened as a result of a meltdown, when they're not able to control how they're behaving. So it is a bit of a worry that these kind of labels are pinned on people, when actually the cause of it, or the reason for the behaviours, is completely different. So I thought that I would just mention those. They're not mental health issues as such, they're a description of observed behaviour, but they do appear in the manuals under mental health difficulties. So, yeah, I've got many children with PDA diagnosed with ODD because of demand avoidance, and this is usually driven by high levels of anxiety. Okay. So mental health issues and autism, is this just part of the autism? I mean, this is something that a lot of parents have said, that they are struggling to get support for their child with autism's anxiety, because they go to someone and they say, well, that's just part of having autism. Yeah, it's true, a lot of people with autism do have anxiety, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be tackled and treated with the seriousness it deserves. Children and young people with PDA do appear to have lower thresholds for anxiety, very quickly triggered into this fight, flight or freeze. An early identification and early intervention can help identify the triggers, and strategies can be put in place to reduce the level of day-to-day anxiety. So it's not just because of the autism, it's because of the unmanaged environment, if you like, and it's the unmanagement part of it that is the tricky bit. So how to access support services, and again, I'm sorry, this is quite, excuse me a minute, this is a bit sort of Anglo-centric, it's a little bit about UK services, but I would be very surprised if the situation wasn't very similar in most parts of the world. CAMS unit, with child and adolescent mental health services across the United Kingdom, are stretched to breaking point. Mental health issues amongst young people are at higher levels than ever, and often formal support can only be accessed when behaviour reaches crisis point, by which time the young people have developed their own coping strategies, which in children with PDA is often the avoidance of demands. So helping children to learn about their own anxiety and their feeling generally, helping them to link their thoughts, their feelings, bodily sensations can be helpful. As this will not come naturally to them. They will need to be taught. Parental anxiety. Again, sorry about this. It can be terrifying when a son or daughter says they wish they were dead or they actively try to hurt themselves. Witnessing a psychotic or dissociative episode is also extremely distressing. In these cases, the advice would be not to panic. Make sure knives, sharp objects and items that can be made into ligatures are kept well out of reach. Often, these threats can be impulsive or they can be cries for help, but impulsive actions can be dangerous. And what you're dealing with a child with PDA is, I keep saying this, poor social imagination, poor ability to think ahead and appreciate what consequences might be. A somewhat impulsive decision to try and do something could have a particularly bad outcome. So it's about recognizing that that is a risk factor for young people on the spectrum and taking reasonable precautions to sort of minimize the risk of anything like that happening. And when the child is calm again, don't be afraid to discuss how they're feeling. Use visual aids or scaling tools to help them express how they're feeling. Keep those lines of communication open. It's vital that they don't feel isolated or alone in the way they're feeling. Try and keep calm, clean any wounds, offer emotional support to validate how they're feeling. And try not to allow your own fears to lead to having no boundaries for the child at all, because that will actually lead them feeling more out of control and anxious. And again, if anyone's interested in reading this, things like the Solihull approach, where they talk about emotional containment, are great as a framework for thinking how a child with no boundaries might feel. So again, it's about not allowing your fears that the child will do something silly or hurt someone to having no boundaries at all. Okay. Finally, I'm just thinking, we're okay. Mental health in adults with PDA. Very limited research into how PDA affects adults. Very few adult psychiatrists have a good knowledge of autism and even less knowledge of PDA, because actually in the UK, adult psychiatrists don't necessarily learn about neurodevelopmental difficulties in children. So they may have limited knowledge about PDA or about how PDA might develop as a person matures. So it can be very difficult to access the right mental health support. It can be quite difficult sometimes to steer people away from the assumption that it's a personality disorder or that it's something completely different. And anecdotal evidence suggests that some adults develop their own strategies that work for them and find ways of avoiding excessive demands and having more control over their own lives. Some sadly continue to experience periods of times when their mental health does suffer. So again, it's another area where more research and more education for adult psychiatrists is needed into the fact that this neurodevelopmental condition doesn't magically disappear and go away when people become adults. And I think that's about it. Oh no, accessing support as an adult. Okay. We'll have, again, it's quite difficult to get a team that actually gets PDA. They may have limited knowledge. So again, self-help resources are useful in developing strategies. And again, I would point people towards dialectical behavioural therapy, toward particularly the skills books, because they are very good at helping to develop strategies to manage distress and to manage those very strong feelings. Again, more research is needed. Okay, and that's it in terms of the actual webinar. I shall stop the screen now and hand back over to Gwen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I don't know who else was writing notes like I was, but my hand hurts. Just to let everybody know, I've had like 4 people say, you never said who you are. Just to let everyone know who I am real quick. My name is Gwendolyn Jones. I'm the resident behavior intervention specialist and parenting coach at Operation Diversity Academy, which for those of you that aren't aware of that is a community of parents and neurodivergent individuals. It's kind of your one-stop shop for all neurodivergence. It's absolutely amazing. We provide webinars and support and all sorts of things. So I highly suggest that you check that out if you haven't heard of us. You know, I like it. So yeah, it is amazing. You're right. So I wanted to let everyone know before I start asking you questions, Judy, that if you are in a crisis point at the moment and kind of looking for that, I hope I don't know what to do with a very specific situation, please remember that, you know, Judy can't give you that magic bullet tonight for that. You've really kind of got to make sure that you're really seeking out the help of professionals and educating yourself, and understanding that this is a very evolving process. So it's not something that you get kind of fixed in a webinar. But the information that you gave us tonight, Judy, was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
That's good. Okay.
So we've had some discussion in the chat while you've been talking, and I'm wondering if you might be able to address this, because I've heard this before actually, where people equate positive behavioral support with applied behavioral analysis. And there's a lot of people that think that that's the same thing. Obviously, within the autism community, ABA is so outdated, and so, you know. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that just a little bit to let people understand the difference between the two.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in PBS, but from what I understand of it, there's a lot about analysing the function of behaviours, a lot about doing functional analysis and thinking what might have been the triggers, what could have been changed in the environment. My understanding of ABA is very different. It's a very different approach, and I don't know that I would be advocating. I don't know an awful lot about it, but it doesn't appear to me the kind of strategy that would work terribly well with individuals with PDA. Positive behaviour support is more about understanding the function of behaviour, not necessarily trying to change it. It's understanding what is triggering it. It's thinking about those triggers. It's thinking, what is it that I can change in this person's environment that will help to decrease their anxiety and make everyone's life. It's about making everyone's life better. It's not about trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole or modify behaviour. It's about understanding behaviour and thinking what can be done within that particular person's setting to make life better for everyone. Does that explain it? It's not ABA.
Yeah.
Analysis is about looking for reasons for behaviour, and that's what I've said all the way through. It's about understanding why the behaviour is happening, understanding the function. What is that young person trying to say? What message are they trying to get across? Is it I can't cope? Is it it's too noisy? Is it the work's too hard? What is it that is behind this behaviour?
Absolutely. And those of you that are in the academy, everything that I do is actually positive behavioral support. So if you've seen my Top Tip Tuesdays or my webinars and things like that, it is all PBS based. And the reason that it works is because you don't focus on the meltdowns and the punitive and the consequences and the rah, rah, rah. You focus on, okay, you're in a calm state now. Let's kind of do a debrief and let's do an autopsy of what just happened and figure out how can we move forward now and do better. So there's a lot of teaching social skills and a lot of, you know, I mean, it's almost like something that's what do I put in place to make myself more successful, as opposed to applied behavioral analysis, which is very punitive and cruel, especially when it's used with children, like young children. I've seen it when I was initially trained. There was ABA was a big thing back in around 2000, and it doesn't feel right. And yeah,
no, it's more about focus. I mean, for me, it's about focusing on the positives, the things that can work and can make life better for everybody, rather
absolutely
than being punitive. It's not about punitive. It's not about dissecting the person in terms of apportioning blame or having consequences. It's about understanding why it happened in the first place and what can be done to make life better for everybody.
Right. And so what I've done is I've kind of gone through the Q&A that we have, where we only have about 10 minutes left. So I've picked out kind of themes that are going through, rather than reading out specific questions like we've done before. So one is, I know we've talked about we don't do punishments for meltdowns because there's no, I mean, you can't, it's not fair. But what are your feelings about natural consequences afterwards? So like, meltdowns happened, you're done, but you've torn apart the living room. Would you have them then go and help put things away, tidy up the kind of chaos that ensued?
Possibly, but I think in some ways the natural consequences that work best are the natural consequences for that young person.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you've broken your iPad and then you no longer have an iPad, that's a fairly good natural. That's not the parent being punitive and saying, this is going to be taken away from you. It's a natural consequence, and life is full of natural consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that they, like any other young person, have to learn about natural consequence. I'm not putting the room back together. I don't know whether that, I don't know, it might trigger another meltdown.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested to hear whether other people have tried that and it's worked.
Mm.
Quite often,
I mean, I've seen people in it, like teachers do it, where they're like, "You'll pick that up now," and obviously that's not going to work when you kind of take that. But more of like a, let's do this together. Let's kind of debrief while we're doing it. Kind of.
yeah.
Yeah, like as a way of saying, let's put life back together. You know.
I think if it's framed in the let's put life back together, rather than you will do this, you cause this mess, you will clear it up. Don't think that's going to work. But shall we tackle this together and let's sort this out and get life back. I imagine that's what most of them want, is to get life back on track again, because most of them are really nice kids and they don't want to behave like that, and probably aren't very pleased with themselves for having done it. So I think your approach is super. That sort of, let's work together, let's sort this out, let's get life back to normal again.
Mm.
And
how do you feel about offering support to siblings and like the level of support that they need to the siblings of the child with PDA? Because certainly, control has been a major issue for them. So, families get to the point where like, I can't even choose what TV show or where we go on holiday because it's going to be a meltdown. And so how would you recommend they support siblings through that?
Oh, negotiation. So, when things are calm, sitting, I mean, yes, you have limited empathy and you have limited social imagination, but it's not absent completely. And when things are calm, maybe some kind of visuals or some kind of social story type approach, where you talk about what you like and what makes you happy and what do you think might make someone else happy, and you like whatever it is you like on the TV. Your sister like, what does your sister like, and actually getting to think about it, because it might not be a natural thing, but it is something that can be learned. It's often they will understand how something feels when they can actually relate it to something they've experienced. So how did you feel when you weren't able to see your TV? What was that like, when you couldn't use the iPad? So it's about kind of relating it back. It's all about how it feels for them, really. You're not going to get a sort of a huge amount of natural empathy, but it is there. They can understand how they feel about things, and they can learn to relate it to how others might feel.
Very good. So one of the other big things that's coming up is the issue of control, where obviously we need to let them feel that they're in control. They don't feel like they're in control, which is why they have the meltdown. But how do you kind of balance? Do you have tips for balancing that? So, the difference between being that harsh person that's like, I said this, and that kind of authoritarian person, versus being the person that's like, okay, kid can do whatever he wants as long as he doesn't melt down. So what tips would you have for managing and balancing that?
But it is about, I mean, I again would come back to the non-negotiables. If you can establish the things that are just not acceptable, and it might be hurting people, it might be kicking people. Okay, perhaps turning over the table isn't such a big thing, but actually kicking people is a no-no. And actually having that as a clearly expressed house rule. Again, it's not easy, but I've talked to a lot of parents, and those that have managed to establish those absolute non-negotiables, the children actually end up feeling contained because they know that that there is a framework there, something is holding them. So it's about picking your battles. It's about, there have to be some, and learning very early on. I mean, depersonalizing it. There are laws. The law says you cannot hit people. If you hit people as a grown-up, there will be, you'll get into trouble. So it's about establishing that very early on, that there are some things that are not you as parents doing it, but those are the laws of the land. That's the way life is, and actually reinforcing those when things are calmer.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. And then also, if your child, I mean, to me, it's like if you're to the point where you've completely lost control and the child has complete control, then it needs to be kind of a graduated way of working back. Don't think that you're going to be able to go, okay, well, I saw a webinar, I've decided I'm in control. It's not going to, it can't be a shock to the system, because that's just going to cause more anxiety. Change is painful for children with autism. So kind of having that graduated, little by little and inch by inch.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. You're better at it than me. You're good at it.
Well, I'm a big descriptive praise. Like, I preach just descriptive praise all the time to people. To me, that is like the #1 parenting tool that everybody needs.
Yeah.
I did a whole webinar on it for the Academy, because I'm like, you need descriptive praise. So
definitely.
I know we have so many other questions. Just to let some of you know too, some of these questions were answered within the other webinars that Judy's done for us, and those will be made available. So, so I know, Judy, you have to get going, and I'm really sorry to have to cut Q&A, but we really appreciate your time tonight. I encourage everybody to go to the Operation Diversity Facebook page to find the other webinars that Judy's done for us, because a lot of your questions will be answered. The recording's also going to be available on YouTube, just because we want to be able to give as much help and support to people. Oh, sorry, not the Facebook page, to YouTube. I'm just getting a message from Sarah. Sorry about that. Once again, Judy's organization is Help for Psychology. And we're Operation Diversity Academy, and between the two of us, hopefully we can offer you as much help and support as we can to help make life a little bit easier living with a child with, or the condition yourself. So thank you once again. 3 webinars. Wow, Judy, thank you so much for all your help and support.
Okay, thank you.
All right, have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.